Welcome, everyone, to the Wizard of Radical Self-Respect. Today I have a very special guest, a narcissistic psychopath, HG Tudor. Many of you may be aware of him already, but it's a great pleasure to have him on the show. How are you today, Mr. Tudor?
I'm excellent. Well, Jared, thank you for your kind inquiry. How are you faring?
Very well. On the other side of the pond here, I'm doing very
Absolutely.
well. And it's great to have you because a lot of people have asked me to talk to you and said, yeah, we'd love to hear you pick his brain about some things. So I'm glad to finally have the opportunity to do so.
Jolly good. Well, my brain is ready to be picked.
All right. Number one, if you could describe to me what your ideal life would be, I think that would paint a good picture of how we should proceed.
Okay. Well, my ideal life is the one that I lead. So there's nothing that I need to change. So I'm successful at what I do. I'm stimulated by what I do. I enjoy, in my form of enjoyment, the games that I play with other people, the schemes that I get involved in. So what I do in my professional and private life satisfies the necessity of keeping the boredom at bay. I'm fortunate in that I'm a good-looking chap in excellent health, that I have money in the bank, I have good places where I live, I have an extensive fuel matrix. I find the world an interesting place. I enjoy the challenges that it presents to me. And I'm focused on certain things which are applicable to what I do professionally, which are providing me with returns, and also, of course, the creation of my legacy through what I do in talking about narcissism and psychopathy. So it isn't a case of thinking, well, the ideal world starts with a Bloody Mary at 6 a.m. before a dip in the pool. It's wider than that. But in essence, I don't have to strive for something that I see as an ideal form of living. I am living that now.
That is a good feeling, isn't it?
Well, it's certainly effective for me, yes.
Now, you mentioned fuel. What is your favorite source of fuel? Is there is it money, power, women, sex? Is there any attention? What is your favorite source?
Fuel is the emotional output generated by a human being as a consequence of something that I've done. So as we're talking now, you're giving fuel to me. Now, you and I, Jared, don't know one another. So you're what's known as a tertiary source in my fuel matrix. And in those circumstances, what that means is that you don't provide me with hugely potent fuel. And although we're not physically proximate, you are providing to me a reasonable amount of fuel because I can see you. So for instance, you're nodding now in comprehension of what I'm saying, and I can see the look on your face. I hear the words that you're using, the tone that you're using. So you're providing me with a reasonable amount of fuel, but you're a tertiary source. And the frequency of that is it's sustained at the moment because we're having a conversation. In terms of, so money per se doesn't provide me with fuel, but if someone was to give me money, the act of them providing me with money is a benign act, which then it is fuel. Money of itself is a residual benefit. The act of giving me money is where the fuel comes from. So if someone was to punch me, they're providing me with negative fuel. And it might hurt because they've landed a blow on me, but they've still provided me with something that I seek, namely fuel. The most potent is that which comes in forms of negative fuel. So, for instance, if I were to hoover a former girlfriend of mine, which would be a former intimate partner primary source, and insult her so she cried, and I did that in person, that would provide me with a lot of very potent fuel and a large amount of it because it's in person. So if you just say, what is my favorite form of fuel? It is negative fuel coming from the most potent person in the fuel matrix, a former intimate partner primary source, which is delivered physically proximate to me. So another way, for instance, you mentioned about, say, sex. Sex of itself provides three things. One, it's a means of controlling somebody. 2, I receive fuel from the person going, ooh, ah, give it to me, big boy, all of that kind of jazz. And thirdly, I experience the pleasure because I have nerve endings too. So the fact of having sex with somebody generates that form of pleasure. But to me, it's more important in terms of using it as a means of control and drawing fuel from them. So there's lots and lots of different ways that I can get fuel, lots of different things, but it's all based upon an interaction with another human being and their emotional response to what I do.
Now, I think it's important for people to know that, like you say, negative fuel is more powerful
Yeah.
than positive fuel, especially when it comes to a hoovering attempt with a former romantic partner. And I think that's something that a lot of people don't realize. But I have also heard you say that you don't think gray rock works.
No.
Maybe you could explain about that.
Okay. I am physically proximate with somebody. Okay. They can sit and try and ignore me, but they are going to respond, because you invariably have an emotional response before your brain kicks in and stops you.
Right.
So I won't do it now out of politeness, but I could say a certain thing to you, and I could say to you, don't react. And I could say something and you would, because I'd see it in your eyes, and you can't control that. You might move your face slightly. You've just given me $1 of fuel. So whilst you might not say anything to me, and whilst you might not even look at me, I could do something if I were physically proximate to you, Jared, so that you would respond. Because ultimately, body language, the look in your eye, and sometimes people speak without intending to. They just can't help themselves. They'll suddenly go, oh, they'll gasp, or they'll go, you motherfucker, or whatever it might be. So the problem with grey rock is, not only can you not turn yourself into something that doesn't provide fuel, because we will get it out of you, but you're also remaining proximate to the narcissist, which means the narcissist will try harder to get the reaction from you, which means you're more likely to suffer an unpleasant experience. But also, those individuals who have an addiction to the narcissist are topping up their emotional thinking by remaining proximate to the narcissist. If you're looking at the narcissist, you'll be thinking about the narcissist. And therefore, and if the narcissist is trying to communicate with you, you're entering the various arenas of interaction and thus increasing your emotional thinking, which you don't want, because that leads to bad decision making. So the problem with grey rock is, 1, you still give us fuel, so we get what we want. 2, you're more likely to increase the chances that we treat you badly, which of course isn't in your interest. And 3, you're going to increase your emotional thinking. What you're much better off doing is just removing yourself from us.
I agree. That is the foolproof way. And a lot of people, they get caught because they want to play the narcissistic person's game. And they care what they think a little bit. So they want to show them maybe, oh, look how good I'm doing. Look how better I'm doing in comparison. But just even caring about that is playing the game.
Absolutely. You make a very valid point there, Jared. That the fact of you want to show to the narcissist, I'm doing well without you. Fantastic. You're reacting to our presence. You're giving us fuel.
Exactly.
And also, you're thinking about us and you're doing something in relation to us. You're increasing your own emotional thinking. You're shooting yourself in the foot. Now, of course, the narcissist may not like the fact to see that you've dropped 2 stone in weight and that you've got a new boyfriend or girlfriend and that you're looking really well. The narcissist won't like that. But the fact that you're reacting to us by showing off, you're giving us fuel nevertheless. It might be challenge fuel, which we have to do something about, but you're still giving us fuel, and you are allowing us back into your life because you're responding to us, and that is not to your advantage. And what happens is emotional thinking corrupts the narcissistic trait of pride or vanity to cause that person to say, I'm doing really well without the narcissist. I want the narcissist to know that I'm doing well. No, you're walking into a trap there. All you need to know is the narcissist, he doesn't need to know how you're doing. However tempting it is to want to show off to the narcissist, don't. Because you're actually going to give us what we want, and you're going to increase your own emotional thinking. And there's lots of instances where emotional thinking corrupts people's traits to cause them to do something which they think is advantageous to them, but actually it is not.
Right. And the narcissists, they are experts at picking up on all those emotional subtleties and the faults in someone else. They know how to do that with their eyes closed. They have this sixth sense for it, it seems.
We're attuned, we're developed to be able to do that. So, for instance, the shark has evolved to frequent the sea, to hunt down its prey. It isn't made for running a race on the land, so it doesn't. We have evolved and are designed so that we pick up on the things that people do, sometimes subconsciously, sometimes consciously, so that tells us that we're dealing with a target that will be advantageous to us. We pick up on responses because we need those responses because it's fuel. We also will see the way that people respond and react to identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities, which we can then log and use against that individual in some shape or form. Sometimes it's by showing false compassion, by pretending to care. Other times it's using that person's vulnerability against them to upset them and disturb them. So we are designed to pick up on those things, and we indeed do.
Yeah, and they are very good at it. Now, do you think we are in an epidemic of narcissism? And I know you believe in lesser narcissist, mid-range, greater, and then you being the only ultra, right?
That's right.
But do you believe we're in an epidemic of narcissism?
I'm not sure I would describe it as an epidemic because we remain in the minority. Nevertheless, there are far more of us than people realize. I think it perhaps would be more accurate to suggest that there is an epidemic of narcissistic behavior where, and I draw the distinction that everybody can be narcissistic because everybody has narcissistic traits: pride, vanity, anger, argumentativeness, showcasing, etc. But that doesn't mean that you're a narcissist. And often narcissistic traits sit within empathic traits and can actually function in a healthy way. But the way that society has evolved is that the necessity of gratification panders to a narcissistic individual because it affords an outcome promptly. And that's what we want, because a prompt outcome gives us control. And one of the prime aims of the narcissist is control. So being able to order food and have it delivered promptly or pick it up more or less immediately, so with the fast food, that accords to a society that panders to what we require. The fact that you can order something and have it delivered the following day, sometimes even the same day. The fact that you can stream a program and binge watch it rather than have to wait every Saturday for 8 weeks to watch it. That catering for immediacy plays into our hands. And also, of course, the rise of social media.
Uh-huh.
Social media was once called social networking, the idea being that if you and I were, say, colleagues or friends, or we knew each other at school, and that we'd moved to different parts of the country, we could find one another on this social network and stay in touch and say, hey, Jared, how are you doing? How's the new job going? I hear you're married now. How's that working out for you, etc. We actually know one another because we were at school together. And that network through the internet has been created to enable us to have the interaction. But then it morphed into something else. It suddenly became the fact that people didn't use it to keep in touch with their cousins in Iowa or their sister who'd moved to Hong Kong. They started to use it to say to the world, hey, look at me. Here's what I'm having for lunch. Who gives a rat's ass about what you're having for lunch? But all of a sudden, people decided that, hey, this means that I've got something to say and the world has to hear it. Now, of course, who is it that caters for the most? My kind. Because the narcissist believes that they are the most important person on the planet. They are the main character in a film. That they create a delusion whereby they are the central individual and that everything must fit in with their likes and desires and their wants, and that the world ought to know about them. And therefore, by creating a mechanism that allows that individual to say to everybody, hey, look, here I am by the Leaning Tower of Pisa with my stupid duck-faced pout. You can all see me now. And oh, look, you're responding to it by giving likes, which is fuel. So it created a playground for narcissists in terms of facilitating a means of getting fuel, facilitating a means of asserting control over people, and laying our hands on more and more people. Like a fisherman who would ordinarily once put one line into the water, we now could have 100 lines waiting for whoever bites. So social media has created this epidemic of narcissistic behavior, because what happens is human beings have a herd mentality. So the narcissist comes along and hijacks social media to show off their picture, as I mentioned, outside the Leaning Tower of Pisa with the stupid duck-faced pout. And then somebody else looks at it who's a normal and goes, hey, that's kind of cool. I'm going to do it now, because human beings mimic, because it makes them feel comfortable. And then what happens is these self-absorbed behaviors that a narcissist engages in then starts to bleed into the mainstream. So more and more people start to behave in that similar way. And as I was only speaking about in a discussion that I was having with Sam on my program, Tea with Sam and HG, about empathy fatigue and compassion fatigue, you have that going on in the background as against an increased method of facilitating people's narcissistic traits. If you think about it, you look like you keep yourself in good order. So you pop down the gym and you're there, curls for the girls, get the suns out, guns out. So you're doing all of the work on your arms and your abs and your chest, but you're not bothering about your legs. What's the outcome? Well, you've got big biceps and big pecs and a washboard stomach, but you've got little chicken legs. And it's similar. The more and more people exercise their narcissistic traits, it becomes more familiar to them. And therefore, their empathic traits become underused and become neglected. And so they don't turn into narcissists because you can't do that. But what happens is those individuals who have both narcissistic and empathic traits, who includes empathic people, narcissists, and narcissistic people, particularly amongst narcissistic people who are not narcissists and normals, they become more narcissistic and they get into a habit of behavior where they become more selfish, that they become more self-absorbed, and they're less inclined to want to help people. And then it builds, because as you create a society that's more like that, who's going to survive better in it? The person that cares about everybody, or the person who's a little bit selfish and a little bit self-absorbed? And it starts to become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, it's certainly feeding the narcissistic part of people, and they're being rewarded. Look at all the content creators that, even me, right? I think most content creators definitely are displaying some narcissistic traits. Doesn't mean they're a narcissist, but it's definitely feeding some sort of fuel for them, I would say.
That's right. I mean, if you think back 25 years ago and you decided that you wanted to be a comedian, you'd have to go down to your local, say in Britain, your working men's club, or there might be a comedy club, and you'd have to say to somebody, please give me a spot. And they'd say, well, tell me a few gags, kid. And you do, and you go, all right, okay. You can have 15 minutes first up on a Sunday night when there's hardly anybody in. And you slog your way around all those working men's clubs, inhaling secondary smoke back in those days, running the risk of lung cancer, getting heckled, occasionally getting beer thrown at you, and goodness knows what else. And little by little, you start to build up that following through hard work. And all of a sudden, 10 years later, you become a big name. And people think that you've come from nowhere, and you haven't, because you've done 10 years of graft. But now people have the capability of thinking, hey, because I'm on the internet, not only do people need to hear what I've got to say, but I should be able to reach millions of people automatically, because they think it's far easier, and it's not. You are holding a match up to the sun. And in a way, you have to go through, similar to what I've just described with slogging around the working men's clubs, you've got to build it up. You've got to create excellent content that people are interested in, engage with your readers, your viewers, be regular in what you provide, engage in some marketing, and you build up a following as people start to notice you. But because of this culture of everything yesterday, and because of the prominence of narcissistic traits that emerge, people think, hey, all I need to do is sit down, plug in, create a YouTube channel, and I'm going to be Mr. Beast within 2 months. You're not. But it creates that narcissistic thinking where people think, oh, I'm going to be automatically rewarded. But then you have to ask, for what? What have you actually done? What have you actually achieved that merits reward? Nothing.
Right.
But people still then have that mindset, and it caters to that narcissism, or rather those narcissistic traits.
And that's the entitlement part of thinking you don't need to do the work to get to the results. That's the big thing to look for. Now, do you have any hobbies? Because I've made the assertion before that a lot of narcissistic people, they really don't have hobbies. They don't lead directly to some form of fuel.
Mm-hmm. There are some narcissists that don't bother with hobbies because they're generally dull and uninteresting individuals. And also that their narcissism is so focused on the pursuit of the prime aims through other means that it doesn't really leave them with capacity for hobbies to do that. But I have hobbies in terms of I prefer to cycle, both in terms of road cycling and mountain biking. So I engage in that. I do some sailing from time to time. Composing music is a hobby of mine. I suppose you could say that my writing is a hobby, albeit I've perhaps taken it to a further level with the extent to which that I engage in doing so. Playing football is a hobby of mine. Watching football, soccer as you would call it. Those are hobbies that I engage in. I used to play Dungeons and Dragons. That was a hobby of mine, but I haven't played that for quite some time. I have an interest in the collection of certain works of literature that I have. So I do have different hobbies, some of which are sports-based, others are more intellectual-based pursuits. So yes, I do.
Interesting. I wouldn't have thought that. Now, some of those, I would say, like the cycling, that can contribute to how you look, which would give you a little bit of fuel. But some of the other ones, the reading, not as much, right? Unless you're going to use it as part of your content, perhaps. But
well, the point of reading is that I have an intellectual curiosity about the world, and one learns from that, and then the learning can be used, of course, towards the pursuit of the prime aims. By being knowledgeable and urbane and a good conversationalist, so being able to sort of explain at dinner, did you know, and then talk about something, then you get people's attention. So the hobby, or somebody might know about the hobby, of course, so it forms a point of triangulation. So they might say, oh, HG, I heard such and such was available. Have you looked into that? And it forms the basis of conversation. And of course, they're giving me fuel and they're showing they're under control because they're asking me about my hobby. So I don't do those things for the simple enjoyment of doing them, because I don't function that way. I do them, as which you picked up on, Jared, because they serve a purpose. So I keep fit. So I keep fit because then I want to live for a long time. And by living for a long time, I can achieve my aims. I keep fit so I look good. So that makes it easier for me to assert control over people by being physically attractive. I am well read so that then I can talk about certain things, and therefore I'm interesting, which makes it easier to control people and draw fuel from them. So the hobbies serve a purpose. They are not engaged in just for the sake of the pursuit itself.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I would have thought. Now, how are you dealing with the aging process? Because I know for me, as someone who has narcissistic traits myself, probably some borderline ones too, aging is one of the things I really dislike. But so how do you handle that?
Well, I deal with it by eating sensibly and ensuring that I have a Patrick Bateman-like personal hygiene regime, so that I can engage in moisturizing and all the rest of it. As mentioned, I exercise, which ensures that the old grey matter gets a good run out. I have a long way off my dotage. Aging is a problem to the narcissist because it's a threat to control, both in terms of the fact that at some point we're all going to shuffle off this mortal coil, and also the fact that with age comes potential problems. You can't run as fast as you once did. That's a threat to the control to the guy who used to be the champion sprinter for his school or county. That you perhaps have those aches and pains, so you can't walk as far as you once did. And it can be more serious, of course. It might lead to someone being infirm and bedbound. So aging is a problem to the narcissist. For me, it isn't such a problem as it would be for other narcissists because, one, I always look after myself, both in terms of body and mind. I also, because I'm well off, I have access to medical care that would prolong my life. And if anything were to happen, I would then have access to that to prevent infirmity in the way that perhaps other people could not. I ensure also that what I engage in are things that keep me stimulated, which also aids with regard to looking after my mind as well. So aging is a concern to narcissists. Some don't really pay much attention, and then they get caught out when all of a sudden in their mid-40s they have a clutcher in an alleyway as a consequence of drinking alcohol, taking too many drugs, smoking and eating ultra-processed foods, etc. And then that's it, game over for them. Others have ongoing health problems, which of course is never their fault. It's always somebody else's fault. You didn't look after me properly. You didn't make food for me that was healthy, etc. But for me, aging isn't a concern because of the steps that I've taken. And people such as me, we invariably do live a long time. It's interesting that you will find some narcissists cark it quite soon, but there are many, even though they might not be particularly well, they live on because there's almost a desire to cling to life that keeps them going because death is such a threat to control that there's almost something inside of them that says, no, you're not taking me yet, the Grim Reaper. And it might be that they're hobbling along with their teeth having fallen out and they've got gout and all the rest of it and heart problems, but they hang in there. I know, for instance, there are individuals within my family who are narcissists, and those buggers are still going, notwithstanding the fact that they ought to have departed some time ago.
Now, you mentioned Patrick Bateman from one of my
Yes.
favorite movies, American Psycho, and you got me thinking about psychopaths versus narcissists.
Yes.
I believe the psychopath is much more Machiavellian, usually, and the narcissist they're more sensitive to criticism, and they're more emotional. But they're more emotional makes it so that you can spot them. The psychopath, on the other hand, they're cool, calm, collect. I kind of think politicians are like that, where in public, they'll act like they're doing the right things, but then behind closed doors, they'll act fairly egregiously.
What's the question?
So the question is, well, you're right. I didn't get to the question.
Are you asking me, do I agree with that assessment?
That's one part of the question, yes. But then the other part would be, American Psycho, is that a good portrayal of a psychopath?
Well, what's interesting is that you could actually have two personality types at work with Patrick Bateman, all dependent upon answering this question: was it real? You see, there is a suggestion that he didn't kill anybody, that he doesn't engage in the amount of sex with women that he believes that he does. And that, therefore, would cater more to him being a narcissist. You see, for example, at one point he goes into the bar and he offers some beer tokens, and the woman says, these aren't valid here. So he asks for his drinks, and when she turns her back to him, he says something along the lines of, I'd like to stab you and play with your blood. And she doesn't react. Now, does she not react because she can't hear him because the music is so loud? Or does she not react because he never said it and it's imagined in his head, and he'd love to be able to do that to her, but couldn't? And for instance, when he's being pursued by the police, he fires his gun and blows up the police car. And then he looks at his gun as if to say, how the hell did that happen? Again, is that the case that it didn't actually happen? So there are lots of instances throughout the film where you might actually form the view that this is an ultra vain individual who looks after his appearance, is obsessed with material things, goes through that detailed sort of skincare and beauty regimen, is wealthy, but is nowhere near as important as he actually thinks he is. And he's preoccupied with getting reservations and so forth. And he knows all the intricacies of music and a sound system and so forth, because that caters to his means of asserting control over people. But when it comes to killing the beggar or nail gunning a prostitute in his apartment, it might be said none of that happens, and it's all within the realm of a fantasy for him, and it's part of his narcissistic delusion. There's also the point as well that later on in the film, of course, he appears to start to have some kind of breakdown when he's outside and he rings up Jean from one of the telephone kiosks, and he starts mumbling incoherently. Again, you wouldn't necessarily see a psychopath engage that way, because they're, as you've identified, they're much cooler and calm about things. So it might well be that he is just a narcissist that would love to be a serial killer, but isn't. So that could be one interpretation. The alternative interpretation is that he is indeed a psychopath that has narcissistic traits, because invariably psychopaths do, that he can't form any connections to anybody, that he has that emptiness that the narcissist does. But furthermore, he doesn't experience any fear. He gets bored very easily, and he sees people as playthings, and that he embraces the emptiness within himself by engaging in the mutilation of prostitutes, the knifing of the beggar in the alleyway, and the cruelty to his animal by stamping on it to kill it. And therefore, those aspects of the psychopathy would be appropriate. Where it perhaps doesn't fit entirely is the point that I mentioned a few moments ago, when he starts to have a bit of a meltdown and he shows that he's having a panicked reaction to situations. That wouldn't necessarily fit with the image of a psychopath. Remember, of course, I've often explained this to people, that film and book and television portrayals often get it partially right, but not entirely right, because they're primarily focused upon entertainment. And therefore, in the same way that when you watch a legal drama, and it's set in the United Kingdom and the judge starts banging a gavel, that's immediately incorrect, because judges in the United Kingdom don't use gavels. But it's included for dramatic effect. And invariably, if you were to ask any lawyer, is this an accurate representation of a courtroom? They'll go, no, it's much more boring than that. And you never have that sudden star witness coming forward, because you have to tell in advance who your witnesses are. And you don't suddenly produce with a flourish the document that proves that he did it, because you have discovery or disclosure ahead of time. So in the way that a legal drama is written to entertain and isn't wholly representative of the way that the law functions and operates, and believe me, I've been in enough courtrooms to know how deadly boring it is. It's the same with these portrayals of narcissists and psychopaths, that some are very accurate, others are reasonably accurate. And with American Psycho, if you were to say, well, I believe that those things actually did happen, then there is a fairly good portrayal of a psychopath, but it's not 100% accurate.
Now, what movies would you say had a great portrayal of a psychopath, and what's maybe one that utterly failed?
No, I think it's No Country for Old Men that has Chigurh. He's a very good portrayal, because he is that walking emptiness, and he embraces that. He is utterly remorse-free, and that people's lives are there to be played with on the flip of a coin. That he doesn't react in a particularly emotional way whatsoever. He's hyper-focused, and his dogged determination in the pursuit of the people that I think it is with regard to the removal of the money. So I think that's probably one of the best portrayals that has existed. In terms of a really sloppy one, off the top of my head, I can't immediately think of one.
I gotcha. So Brene Brown, I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, but she says that narcissism is the shame-based fear of being ordinary. What are your thoughts on that statement?
It isn't accurate, because most narcissists are unaware and they actually don't experience any shame. What tends to happen is that people have built this concept of a narcissist experiencing shame to sort of explain the behavior, when actually it's related to the need for control over people. and the need for validation. And this idea of shame, it's a little bit, the way that I see it, is that it's almost been done in the way that when people talk about karma, karma doesn't exist. It's just a device that's been created to make people who've been defeated feel a bit better about themselves, because then they can say, well, karma's going to get you. No, it won't. The world doesn't work like that. But if it makes you feel better to think that way after you've been left in the dust, then you can think it. But so I think similarly with the concept of shame, it's been done by people who don't really understand the narcissist to think that that is what is going on, and that they experience this shame, and that's what drives their behaviors. It isn't. It's linked to that necessity of control, because the narcissist is created out of a lack of control environment and a genetic predisposition towards that. So again, it's one of the misunderstandings that occurs. Now, they might say is that this shame is deep-seated, but the narcissist doesn't know about it. The narcissist believes themselves to be hugely effective, that their narcissism has created this fantasy world which everybody else has to accept because that's their reality. But that's the whole point. It is their reality where they don't have remorse, save where it's false. They don't experience shame, although they might manufacture it in order to manipulate somebody.
And I know traditional psychology, they always say, oh, a narcissistic person, they got to be covering up some sort of insecurity or fear or lack. And I had interviewed Dr. George Simon. He had wrote In Sheep's Clothing and Character Disturbance. And he said, it's not always that way. It can sometimes be that way, but sometimes they just have a full entitled belief in themselves and they're just destructive. And he said, a lot of people, it makes them feel better to think, oh, they must be covering up an insecurity. They must be covering up shame. But in reality, it's not always that way.
That's the point that I'm making. It's done to make people feel a bit better about the fact that they're the one that's lost out. There is, of course, it is a matter of perspective, because the narcissist needs control. So you could argue that such a high level of control that's required means, by definition, the narcissist has an insecurity about not having control. Whereas other people, they wouldn't care. So you could perhaps argue it that way. But the narcissist doesn't feel that insecurity because they believe the propaganda that the narcissism has generated. They don't sit at home and think, I'm an awful person and, oh my goodness me, an abject failure, because the narcissism won't let that happen. That's why these people have the ability to get up on a stage and perform in the way that they do, that many people go, oh, I couldn't do that. I'd feel a bit silly. Parading around in those crazy outfits. The narcissist loves it because it's what they're born to do. Because all of those people are cheering them, which is providing them with massive amounts of fuel. And they don't get up there thinking, I look like a prize plum dressed up this way. They think, I look absolutely brilliant, because the narcissism tells them that. So they don't have that insecurity. There'll be some narcissists that utilize insecurity as a means of controlling people. Does my bum look big in this? And the person goes, oh, no, you look fantastic. All that person has just done is give that narcissist fuel and show that they're under control. They don't genuinely believe that their bottom looks big. They believe that they look absolutely stunning and delicious and nobody can resist them. But they say that because the narcissism dictates that posing as this supposed vulnerable individual, it's a means of getting the control. So it depends on what type of narcissist you're dealing with. Some are really in your face, seem like supremely confident. Others engage in the more covert behaviors and seem less certain of themselves, but they're not. It's just an artifice that's devised by the narcissism to get what it requires.
Now, do you believe a full-blown narcissist can change?
No. There is no point, and it's pathologically impossible to happen, because the narcissism is hermetically sealed. And what happens is that it won't let the narcissist contemplate change, because that would be a threat to control. So it's a little bit like if you have, I don't know, purple spot disease, and a doctor comes towards you with the cure. Purple spot disease makes you run away from him. So the narcissism won't allow any method to get close to it to try and effect change, to begin with. And even so, even if it did, for instance, where the narcissist goes to some kind of therapy, all that happens is the narcissism uses that therapy to its advantage rather than allowing the therapy to effect permanent and long-lasting change. Because remember, in the narcissist world, there's nothing wrong with them. They might say to somebody, oh, I've got my demons and, I cause so many problems for people. That's just a pity play, which is a form of manipulation. It's not genuine. The narcissist does not believe there's anything wrong with them. Therefore, why would they change? I suppose in the future, there's always the potential that you could strap a narcissist down and find the section of the brain that's affected by this personality disorder and somehow zap it so that that could cause change. But then that brings with it a whole manner of legal and ethical considerations. But as it stands, there's no means of doing so. There are those that claim that change can be effected. And there are some people, of course, that come along and go, hello, I used to be a narcissist, and now I'm healed, and now I've changed. Well, with those individuals, they were either not a narcissist to begin with, and basically they were probably a bit of an arsehole, and people who are just arseholes can change their behaviors. Or they are a narcissist and they haven't changed at all, but their narcissism convinces them that they have for the purpose of telling an audience that. So people go, oh, fantastic, well done, that's great, and they get all of the fuel from them.
Now, so you don't think they could learn how to respond rather than react and take a step back and all that good stuff?
There's no need to. What you're trying to do is say to somebody, you are not effective as the way that you are, so you need to do it this way. And that's immediately challenging a narcissist. Because the narcissist would go, I don't see the point in what you're saying to me. There doesn't need to be any alteration. Well, don't you see, for instance, that, all of your relationships end in disaster? Oh, well, that's because, I just end up I get women that come and pick me who are, just out to get money out of me. Immediately, there's the narcissism deflecting evidence of a problem. Yeah, but you've always had difficult relationships with the family. Well, I can't help it that I've been born into a family of idiots. Again, there it is, the narcissism deflecting it. The narcissist will not genuinely go, yes, I recognize that my behavior is problematic, that it's caused relationships to falter, that it's caused me to have problems with my family, that I can't keep a job down. Is there a way of me changing my behavior so that I actually don't cause those problems any longer?
Right.
They might say that, but again, it's not genuine. Saying that is a form of manipulation. As soon as you suggest to that narcissist, you are less than perfect because of this, their narcissism jumps in as the self-defense mechanism that it is to go, but it's not my fault, so why are you trying to make me change?
I see. So you would say that anyone who learns how to admit they were wrong, they probably weren't a full-blown narcissist to begin with. And
yes,
I've seen people go to AA, NA, and maybe they weren't full-blown narcissists, but they had toxic behaviors. They had narcissistic behaviors. And they did learn how to admit their shortcomings a little bit.
Yep.
And it appeared like they got better. But you would say they weren't full-blown.
Precisely. It may well be the case that they did get better. Take, for example, an 18-year-old man. He's been brought up with no paternal influences. And mother has done the best that she can, but there are some other siblings. They're in a low socioeconomic group. He wasn't interested in school, and it was more fun to run with the pack. He gets involved in petty crime. He's been taking drugs, and he's known as being a bit of a shit by those in the locality. But then, as a consequence of the risk of having a lengthy prison sentence, he's basically given that one last chance. And by happenstance, he goes into the armed forces. And that provides him with some discipline, and it provides him with motivation and guidance and all of those things which he's been hitherto lacking. He then turns his life around. Why? Because his behaviors were not pathological. They were not centrally fused to who he was. That he was basically someone who was on the wrong side of the tracks, but when some positive influences come along, he's able to change his behavior for the better and stick with that. So that where you hear those success stories, and they do exist, you're not dealing with a narcissist that's changed. You're dealing with somebody else who, for instance, most criminals are drawn from people who are normal. There are lots of narcissists that are criminals, but there are far more normals on the planet, and far more of them engage in criminal behavior. And those normals, for instance, They will go around and beat up somebody who's a rival selling drugs on their turf, but then they'll look after their children and really do love their children because they've got emotional empathy as a normal for their children, but not for their drug rival. And if they decide over time, and of course as they get older and testosterone reduces, etc., they can see that actually it's better to stay on the straight and narrow. So they can affect those changes because they didn't have pathologically fused behaviors to begin with. They didn't see the world through a particular lens that skews everything. They didn't have that distortion field.
Now, I've heard you say that you think genes are someone's ingredients, and then their environment is like the oven. And in order to develop narcissism, the ingredients got to go into the oven, and it's cooked. Now, do you believe it always needs the environment, or can it just be the genes in some cases?
With regard to narcissism, it requires the genes, the genetic component, and you must have an environmental influence as well.
Okay. That's what I was curious about. And I've been seeing a lot of these narcissists and self-aware borderlines, self-aware narcissists create YouTube channels, create TikToks. What do you think about that whole trend?
Well, as I alluded to earlier on, many of those individuals aren't actually narcissists. They just think that they are. And many people like attention. It's probably that they're narcissistic, but not narcissists. So that they create these channels. And what you'll find with them is they don't provide you with anything novel, unique, or meaningful in their interpretation. And they regurgitate other people's material and particularly regurgitate some of the myths about our kind. So you have that. Then you also have some who will be narcissists, but they are what I categorize the narcissist who would be king. They think they're aware and they're not. So they think that they know it all, but they actually don't. And they are, although they know that they're a narcissist, they think that they are a greater when actually they're a mid-ranger. And so what happens is they are unaware of what they truly are. And what you tend to find with those individuals as well is that they either talk about how, you know, I've conquered my narcissism and I've reined it in and I've become a better person, or they over-egg the pudding about going, basically, I'm totally evil and here are the reasons why. And it becomes more like a pantomime villain. And I get emails from people like that, and it's just laughable because when I cross-examine them about, okay, well, explain to me how your Machiavellian world operates, I just get vague answers, which demonstrates to me it doesn't really happen. And it goes back to the point that their need to brag and boast about these things is part of their need to assert control. But a truly aware narcissist just gets on with it, with a greater, doesn't need to brag about all of that. I tell people about the way that I behave through the cloak of anonymity to explain narcissism and psychopathy. But believe me, I don't sidle up to my friends and go, psst, guess what I did today? Because only a moron would do that.
Right.
I don't say, hey, I just shafted this individual. I sit down and start talking to them about football because that enables me to control them and draw fuel from them. I don't have to. If I started telling you, you'll never guess what I did on the way home, and where I've done something unpleasant to somebody, they'd be thinking, you're an asshole. And I've immediately threatened my control over them.
Right.
Well, only an idiot would behave that way. So there is very much a trend at the moment for people to stick themselves on YouTube and TikTok. And unfortunately, much of what they talk about is errant nonsense. And they're not really helping anybody with their observations.
So basically, you would say they're LARPing pretty much. And I agree with what you say, though, because if they were truly that way, maybe they wouldn't put their face out there. Maybe they wouldn't want to be so.
Yeah. So they, as I say, with some of them, they're just narcissistic and they're enjoying the attention, and they basically see, and because they've got nothing novel about themselves, they think, oh yeah, this is garnering a lot of attention. So, and I could make some money here. So I'll talk about how I'm a narcissist and so on and so forth. And remember, the term gets bandied around so much that there's many people who use it to describe someone that basically has done something to them that they didn't like. That's not a narcissist, but people use it in that way. And then, as I mentioned, there are some who are actually narcissists, but they don't realize that they're truly unaware. They think they're aware and they're not. And they start churning out nonsense. And invariably, they engage in talking about things which aren't accurate. because they have to, because they haven't got any substance to what they're talking about.
That makes sense. Now, I've heard you say before that if you could speak to anyone, you would have loved to talk to Christopher Hitchens.
You've been paying attention, haven't you?
Yeah, you got to do your homework, you know? So, you like Christopher, and it got me thinking, do you believe in free will? Because that's a big debate he would have a lot of with himself and Sam Harris, etc.
Do I believe in free will? I think we're chained to the individuals that we are. So I am able to make decisions that suit me. So I would suggest that I have free will, but that is within the scope of what I am. And therefore, I am governed by the fact that I am a narcissistic psychopath. That frames my behaviors. So within that frame, I have free will. I choose to do what I do because I have to have that control. So I would suggest that I have a higher degree of free will than many other people because I do what I want to do. And if you get in my way, I'll disincentivize you so that I can achieve what I want to do. And in some instances, if what I want to achieve is not something that can be done at that moment in time, then I'll park it and revisit it. But by the same token, I have to recognize, and this is part of the insight that I have, that my decision making is framed within the fact that I'm a narcissistic psychopath. And therefore, I operate within those parameters, which would suggest that I've not got complete free will because it's fettered to the personality that I have.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. And when I learned about that concept, it was really discouraging to me because it seemed true. Where I'm like, look at all these things that we don't have control over that determine who we are. We don't choose our parents. We don't choose how tall we're going to be, our face, our genes, our environment. All of these things that have such a big impact, no control over. And
yes, that's right. I mean, you don't. It's not like you start off life at the beginning of some kind of video game where you can choose, as you point out, choose your height, choose your skin color, choose the way that you look. That's all predetermined by other factors, and then, of course, those factors then impact upon how you go through life. In terms of, you might have certain disabilities, which then make your decision making restricted. It may mean that you have different opportunities compared to other people. People who are more attractive, it may open more doors for them compared to people who are less attractive, or that then they have restricted decision making because they're preoccupied with the way that they look compared to somebody who isn't bothered about their looks, that embraces the world. So all of those predetermined factors are going to impact upon the way that somebody behaves and take away a lot of choice. And so I think ultimately that the attainment of free will, there are just degrees of it.
yeah, I agree with that. I think the discouraging part for me about it was if you don't have free will, then you don't get the credit for your achievements anymore. And that was something that really just was off-putting to me.
Well, that would suggest that you are essentially automated.
Right.
And therefore that what you do is being caused by somebody else, where the credit lies. But ultimately, unless you think that we're all in a simulation and this is an alien playing a video game and that you and I don't really exist, and therefore it's the alien that's causing me to write all of these books, and therefore it's the alien's credit, which I don't believe is the case, then I wrote those books and I've advised those people, therefore the credit lies with me. So I think that where the suggestion is, if you don't have free will and therefore you don't get credit for your achievement, that would only be applicable if you were some form of automaton that was being controlled by somebody else.
Are there any modern thinkers today that you really admire or look forward to hearing?
As mentioned, I enjoyed what the Hitch had to say. Jordan Peterson has some interesting things to say if he's not crying. So I like to hear what he's got to say. Of course, there's individuals that come out with observations which one might not necessarily agree with, but it's interesting to understand their perspective. So Andrew Tate's an example of that. There's not a lot I agree with because I find him quite amusing, really, in the way that he bigs himself up as this alpha male. But nevertheless, the views that he has, to understand that person in terms of understanding more about the type of person that he is. I wouldn't necessarily describe him in the bracket as a modern thinker, but he does certainly have influence over the way that some people think with regard to the impact that he has upon a section of society that actually has been left behind. And I think really when many people focus on him, they're doing so unnecessarily, because Tate's just a symptom. He isn't a cause. He's a symptom of what has happened to a lot of young men who find themselves in a situation where they are more likely to die at a younger age than compared to women. They're less likely to have sustainable careers compared to women. They're more likely to experience health problems. They're more likely to be proponents of crime or victims of crime, etc. And so there's this strata, and the statistics back it up. You know, in some instances, they're 3 times more likely to have these problems compared to women. And this isn't to have a go at women and say that they're at fault. There's something else that's at fault. And therefore, it's understandable that someone such as Tate will tap into those disenfranchised and individuals and harness them with his particular brand of thought. So it's interesting to listen to what he has to say. One doesn't have to agree with it. In a similar way, Jordan Peterson, he also taps into this disenfranchised section of society, but he does it in a much more cerebral, intellectual way.
You know, speaking of Jordan Peterson, when I see him crying like that, tell me if it's this way for you too, but I find it to be like a manipulative, like almost covert narcissistic tactic when he does it, where he wants to elicit a response. So I listen to it and I'm like, just stop, man. Like, stop crying. It seems like you're trying to get sympathy or manipulate their impression of you or something.
I agree with that.
Yeah. And as far as Tate goes, I'm pretty familiar with him too. And I would consider him one of the rare narcissists that have more emotional self-control than many of the others do. And that's partly why he's been able to do what he's done. But he's also gotten himself into trouble too by doing stuff behind closed doors.
He experiences the law of collateral consequences, which invariably visits lesser and mid-range narcissists. So, for instance, if the allegations are true, and of course he hasn't been charged with anything and hasn't been convicted of anything, and it's important to make that clear for balance. But just recently in the United Kingdom, a civil action is being proposed against him by, I think, 3 or 4 women who allege that he mistreated them sexually. So there's one lady who said that she formed a sexual relationship with him which was consensual, but partway through he started to throttle her, started to strangle her. She passed out, and when she came to, he was still having sex with her. Now, if that allegation is correct, what you have there is a man who asserts control over her while he's having sex. So he asserts control, he draws fuel from her response, but as part of asserting control over her, he strangles her and then continues to have sex with her because he has no emotional empathy for her, no sense of compassion for her, no boundary recognition. So he's getting the control, tick that box. He's getting the fuel until such point as she passes out, tick that box. But then he creates a problem whereby he has conceivably committed a crime, and that's the collateral consequence. And the style of narcissist that he is again with the operation that he was purportedly running in Romania, was one that he's been accused of sex trafficking. Again, he hasn't been charged with anything. There are no convictions. But if that information is accurate, he asserts control over these people, over his viewers. He makes money from it. So there he gets a residual benefit. He's getting the fuel. He's getting the control. The collateral consequence is he's engaging in criminal conduct, and then he gets raided and thrown in the slammer. And that's what happens with the lesser and mid-range narcissists. For Jordan Peterson, he's not going to be going around committing criminal acts. That's not his style. But what can then happen is he turns on the waterworks. There's some people go, oh, he's so in touch with his feelings. This is an emotionally empathic man. But then there's going to be a group of people who are going, what a simp, what a pansy, what a beta cuck he is. And then that threatens his sense of control because his standing with that group goes down. So the problem is that with certain narcissists and their behavior, it creates a collateral consequence, which they then have to deal with. And the narcissist always does deal with it, invariably by kicking the can down the road again and again and again. But the world just doesn't stop for that narcissist. They find themselves going to prison. They find themselves losing the job. They find themselves losing friends. They don't care about that. because they have no sense of compassion or remorse, but it impacts upon them in a haphazard life.
Now, do you think narcissists and psychopaths do good for the world? Because I think
Yes.
they do in some cases.
Absolutely. I do. I educate people. I give them solutions to the problems that they find themselves in. And that's just within what I do as what I call blog world. What I do professionally, although I can't talk about it in detail, I'm essentially one of those rough men that does the unsavory things that enables people to sleep well at night. And if people knew what I did, they would say, well, those people get what they deserve and that you're a good man. But I do engage in some unsavory activities.
Sure.
So the whole thing, of course, about good and evil, as I've repeatedly explained, it's very much a matter of perspective. And it's one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Narcissists are driven to create brilliant things, companies that improve the human condition, surgeons who want to save that person because it makes them look good, and they will fight and fight. They won't give up on that person until they bring them back to life. But for every one of those, there are several of your scum narcissists that leech off society, that break up homes and don't really add anything to the sum of the human condition. So it's absolutely the case that many narcissists and psychopaths do good, in inverted commas, but there's a lot more that do bad, in inverted commas.
Sure.
But the point is, even with those of us that do the good, there's always some bad associated with it. There's going to be a girlfriend who's being cheated on. There's a wife that's being berated. There's a fan. There's a friend who's been scapegoated. There's a business rival that's been shafted. There's always skeletons in the cupboard if you can find them.
And I mean, I think as dark as the world is today, there needs to be someone with some dark triad type traits to even begin to try to make a difference with some of it. And then someone that can get in there and then choose to do good, choose to good, like live by principles and whatever.
Well, it raises an interesting question in that where all of these problems originated from in the first place, were they created by the narcissists and psychopaths, and then do other narcissists and psychopaths come along and clean up their mess because it makes them look good?
There's certainly some of that in there too.
Yeah. Take people who are first responders who are narcissists. They go where angels fear to tread. Why? Because it makes them look good and enables them to get the fuel and control. Oh, thank goodness you saved my child from the burning building. He didn't do it because he cares. He did it because he looks good. But at the end of the day, what do you care? Saved your child. Now, who set the building on fire? Your jealous ex, who's also a narcissist. So we have one narcissist that wants to cause trouble for his ex by setting her house on fire, which endangers her child. And then another narcissist comes along who's part of fire and rescue, who saves the child.
Yin and yang there a little bit. They work
Indeed.
in tandem. Absolutely.
Indeed.
So to wrap things up here in a minute,
Yes.
if you were to say, like in 5 years, everything goes exactly how you want it to go, what do you think your life would look like in 5 years?
In 5 years' time, I will have extended my reach in terms of blog world. I'll have retired from what I do professionally. I'll have hung up certain things by that stage. I will have created more books. I will have stylized more in terms of my offering, and my reach will have been extended so that the march to ensure that more and more people are educated about narcissism and psychopathy, those goals are met.
And speaking of Jordan Peterson, he would always say, create your heaven and then create your hell. Could you maybe describe what hell would be for you?
Yeah. Well, hell for me is being forced to listen to Celine Dion against my will.
So no Titanic for you.
No, watched it, did so because it was necessary to maintain control over a intimate partner primary source at the time. Once was enough, thank you very much.
And last question for you. What is the number one thing that you think people get wrong about narcissism? The things that really annoy you? And are there professionals that do this too?
The number one thing that people get wrong is thinking that it must be exhausting being a narcissist. It's not. It's what we're designed for.
Well, makes perfect sense to me. Any other closing comments, HG?
All I would add is that thank you very much for inviting me on, and your interesting questions that you've posed. I've enjoyed answering them for you. And that if anybody wants my help to understand more about narcissism and psychopathy and join the millions of people that have been freed by information, they can watch me on my YouTube channel, which is HG Tudor, Knowing the Narcissist, theultra, or they can read more at Narcsite, which is spelled NARCSITE.com. And they can read thousands of articles gratis, which will give them enlightenment, entertainment, and understanding. And there you can see the various aspects in the menu, so that if you want to book my services to talk to me, so that I can unravel the problems for you and provide you with the solutions you can do, or if you want to determine if somebody's a narcissist, etc., you can look at all of the various products and services that I offer.
And if you send me those links, I'll put them in the description too.
No problem.
All right, Mr. Tudor, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. I appreciate you giving me the time.
Not at all. Pleasure to have spoken to you, and I look forward to doing so on another occasion.
Sounds very good to me. I would like that.
Jolly good. Well,
right,
get in touch and we'll organize that.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Okay. Thank you.
You have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.